Evan McMillan idolized his father. It wasn't just that he was heir to a great fortune, it was the way he ran the estate. Raised under his firm hand, Evan had taken to running the workforce with an iron hand. Production was always high and the McMillan estate prospered under father and son. As Archie McMillan's mental health slowly disintegrated, Evan protected him from the herd who wanted a piece of the fortune. No matter what his father asked of him, Evan would do. When Archie McMillan finally snapped, Evan became his enforcer, in what would become known as the worst mass murder in modern history. They never proved that Evan led over 100 men into those dark tunnels before detonating the explosives and sealing them to their fate. The tale of the McMillan estate is a tale of wealth and power gone very wrong. How many victims fell to the hands of father and son is unknown. No record is ever made of what became of Evan McMillan. His father is another unsolved puzzle, found trapped in the locked basement of his own warehouse, starved and abandoned. Philip Ojomo came to this country without anything than hope for a new beginning. He was happy as he got offered a job at Autohaven Wreckers, a small scrap yard where bribed cops turned a blind eye for the somewhat shady business that took place. Ojomo didn't care. He had seen criminal activity up close in his homeland, and as long as he didn't get involved, he let things be. He just fixed cars and handled the crusher. Something he did really well. A car went in and a small, metallic cube came out. It was not until one gloomy day that he, just by accident, saw some blood coming from one of the uncrushed cars. As he opened the trunk he found a young man, gagged and with tied hands with panic-filled eyes. Ojomo freed the man who managed to run 10 feet before Ojomo's boss stopped him and slit his throat. As Ojomo demanded answers he got explained to him that he'd been nothing more than a simple executioner, as more or less every car had a soul in them, as this was a service the scrapyard provided to certain clients. Ojomo snapped and went ballistic. He threw his boss in the crusher and let it slowly compress. As the head stuck out, Ojomo grabbed it and pulled head and spine out of the body. Then he left and was never seen again. The son of wealthy landowners Max Thompson Sr. and Evelyn Thompson, this unnamed boy was an unwanted child born to savage parents. Hideously disfigured, he was shut away from society. So ashamed of their son, they bricked him off into a room and fed him through a hole in the wall. When the boy escaped, he took his revenge savagely and terribly, slaughtering the parents that had tortured him instead of raising him. After the deed was done, he continued to live his life at the farm, taking out his deranged violence on the animals that were allowed to run free. As he finally broke free from his shackles he ran through the cornfields, chasing and slaughtering whatever he could find. They never found the bodies of Max and Evelyn, but they did find tortured and disemboweled animals all over the farm. Cold Wind Farm was quickly settled and the land split up and sold off. There was never a buyer for the farmhouse. Perhaps it was the sound of the chainsaw you could hear throughout those hot summer nights. Sally Smithson came to town with dreams of children's feet and laughter in a wooden home built by her husband Andrew. But life came not with smiles but with plans of destruction. Andrew worked as a lumberjack, a job with its perils. One day, Andrew's foreman had to pay Sally a visit, forever changing her life. She was alone. Without food on the table and no other option, Sally had to find a way, but the only employment she could get was at the Crotus Pren Asylum. Nobody sought employment there unless they were in dire need. Just like Sally. Without any education, she started at the bottom, doing the hard night shift. Over the years, her mind had reached its limits, 2 decades of seeing horrid things that violate the eyes. Memories that are replayed every night. Being abused verbally and physically by people without limits. Sally saw insanity from the outside, just to catch it herself. Finally she could not take it any more and concepts of purification emerged inside her. She did what she felt was necessary. As the morning staff arrived one day in September, they found over 50 dead patients, lifeless, in their bed along for staff members also dead. Only Sally had survived the night, but her mind was gone, rocking back and forth non-stop. Exactly what happened is only known by her, but it seems that some of them had been choked as they had marks around their necks. They got her into an ambulance, but that ambulance never reached the hospital. It was found crashed in a nearby wood, all the staff dead and Sally nowhere to be found. Some humans are simply bad seeds. Seeds infused with a distilled and pure form of evil. Michael Myers is one of those seeds. He had no issues with causing the pain of others. Instead, it was exactly what he sought. But even life can be tough on those with minds filled with terror. The difference is just how one goes about to solve those problems. For Michael, he had to kill to find some inner peace. As he took his sister's life, the police found a silent boy dressed as a clown at the scene. When one stumbles upon a growing fire, one does not pour gasoline on it. But this was an action taken by officials that had no idea how it would shape this demon in the boy's body. Sending Michael to a mental institution was a feeble attempt to save the child. Unsuccessful therapy and nightly screams just made him even more introverted and deranged. People hoped that Michael Myers would end up a parenthesis, soon to be forgotten and buried, a failure that soon were to rot away. But then he escaped. Lisa Sherwood grew up in a quiet village, mainly isolated from the rest of civilization. The people of the hamlet were kind and the elders kept old traditions alive, often keeping the peace by personally settling the ever-rare disputes. Lisa was particularly fond of the charms they taught her to draw for safety and good fortune. One night, as she was walking home through the woods, a terrible storm struck without warning. Howling winds whipped at her hair as she stumbled through the swamp, her rain-drenched dress plastered to her skin. In the slick, wet mud she lost her footing, careening backwards and striking her head against rock. Slipping in and out of consciousness, she strained to identify the dark shapes approaching her from between the trees. That's the last thing she could remember. Her kidnappers kept her chained to the wall in a flooded cellar. Though dimly lit, she could see others whose large open wounds swarmed with flies. It took merely a day before they returned, carving chunks from the prisoners' bodies with rusted blades, consuming their very flesh down to the bone. Most she saw did not survive long once the cannibals targeted them, but somehow, deep within, Lisa persisted. Starved, infected, and mutilated after several weeks of torture, her gaunt arms became loose in their shackles. She pulled hard, the metal tearing through skin and muscle until she was free. Her flesh oozed viscous yellow pus and bones were visible beneath gangrenous wounds. She could go no further. Delirious, she thought of home, she thought of the elders. With her dying breath, she etched the symbols they had taught her into the floor using what remained of her fingers. Almost in response, a dark hunger stirred inside her. It yearned for blood. In oath, she chose vengeance. The village's search party eventually brought them to an old shack in a swamp. Inside, its previous inhabitants had been viciously dismembered and devoured by an unidentifiable animal. In the cellar, amid rotting corpses and disconnected flesh, the elders' charms were scrawled in blood on the floor. Lisa's body was not among the bodies and was never found. The village was never the same again. From an early age, Herman Carter understood the human psyche. To analyze and deconstruct something as powerful as the brain intrigued him. He was an apt pupil and gained the attention of his teachers. He excelled in high school and was published in Partisan, a psychology gazette. Within a year, Carter was fast-tracked into Yale's advanced neuroscience program, really a front for the CIA. Brainpower is a must if you're about to conquer the world and demolish foes across the pond. The CIA understood this, so interrogation and intelligence became their #1 priority. All they needed were brilliant people, like Carter. Carter and other top-tier recruits were transferred off-campus and into a secret black site facility in Illinois known as Larry's Memorial Institute. A protege craves a mentor, and that's where Dr. Otto Stamper stepped in, who taught Carter that information is everything and knowledge is power. He was given all instruments needed, a guiding hand, and more or less everything he asked for. He never realized that sunlight had started to become so scarce that he too was kept in the dark. Because knowledge doesn't only give you power, it also transforms you into a threat. To extract information was his mission. Dr. Stamper encouraged Carter to go further and not to consider this a normal medical facility. No eyes were watching them, there were no rules to abide. The agency just pointed Carter in the right direction, then he started to take a few steps back as he saw how Carter could walk on his own. Docile test subjects were exchanged for real, live spies. People that played a role in the troubles outside the facility. Carter shouldered this new role. Project Awakening took form, and on paper Carter described it as experimental interrogation. It was approved, and over a few months, nobody knocked on his door. Screams and moans filled the corridor outside his lab, but wars skew people, and what they accept, as long as the enemy is kept at bay. The fluorescent lights flickered more and more often. Electroconvulsive treatment became a standard dish on the menu. Prisoners held at the facility begged the guards to take them to any other lab but Carter's. Rumors were disregarded in the beginning. Over the years, Carter became known as the doctor, and no one ever questioned if he had even held a medical certificate or even what happened to the prisoners after they had given up their information. It was only after the Larry's Memorial Institute went silent for a week that they finally uncovered the true horror of what had happened there. Carter's experimental information extraction had turned to horrific and bizarre torture. Patients and prisoners were found dead or in vegetative states with all types of head trauma. In his office, they found the most terrible discovery of all. Dr. Stamper himself, his head peeled open and an array of electrodes and sensors inserted into his still working but annihilated brain. There was no sign of Herman, the Dr. Carter, but his research papers suggested that he had been using the prisoners as part of awful ECT experiments as he searched for the panacea of mind control. The government didn't want to know. The black site was condemned and all knowledge of the Larry's Memorial Institute redacted forever. Updated lore. Showing exceptional aptitude in psychology, Herman was handpicked for special training in an advanced neuroscience program located in a secret black site facility in Illinois known as Larry's Memorial Institute, really a front for the CIA. This is where Herman met Dr. Otto Stamper, where, under his guidance, Herman began to use strange and ever-increasingly vicious methods to extract information from prisoners sent to the Institute, which was also a covert prison and re-education center for whoever was the USA's current nemesis. His liberal use of violent electroshock therapy revealed dramatic results, and several threats to national security were uncovered. Over the years, Herman became known as the Doctor, and no one ever questioned if he had even held a medical certificate or even what happened to the prisoners after they had given up their information. It was only after Larry's Memorial Institute went silent for a week that the true horror was finally discovered. The personnel, patients, and prisoners were all found dead with all types of head trauma. All personnel and prisoners' bodies were accounted for, including Dr. Stamper, but no sign of Herman, the Dr. Carter. As soon as Anna was able to walk, her mother started teaching her how to survive a harsh, solitary life in the northern woods. Living in such an extremely remote and dangerous area required skill and resilience. When sunlight became too dim for productive activities, they would take refuge in their house, a sturdy old cabin constructed to resist the toughest winters. Close to the hearth's warmth, Anna would rest in her mother's arms, surrounded by the few wooden toys and masks she had crafted for her. Drifting off to sleep with stories and lullabies, she dreamt happy dreams, ignorant of the events that would soon change everything. Anna and her mother were stalking a great elk through the woods. They knew it was dangerous prey, but it had been a particularly difficult winter, and they were almost out of food. The specter of starvation frightened them more than any forest creature. Without warning, the elk reared, bellowed, and charged at Anna. She was paralyzed with fear as the whole world seemed to shake under the immense beast's pounding hooves. The elk was close enough for Anna to see the murderous fury in its eyes when her mother threw herself in its path, axe in hand. A blood-curdling scream escaped from her lips as the elk impaled her upon its antlers and hoisted her into the air. With all her strength, she brought her axe down on its head again and again while it tried to shake her loose. With a sickening crack, the antlers snapped and Anna's mother was free. The beast collapsed. Anna was too small to move her mother's broken body, so she sat with her in the clearing where she had fallen. To distract her from the dying elk's cries, Anna's mother held her and hummed her favorite lullaby. They stayed like that, the huntress and the elk getting quieter and colder, until Anna was alone in the silent forest. Eventually she stood up and started the long walk back home. Still a child, she knew just enough about life in the frozen forest to survive. She followed her instincts and became one with the wild. She got older and stronger and practiced her hunt. As she grew into a dangerous predator, her humanity became a half-remembered dream. She widened her territory and lived off her hunts. She worked her way up through squirrels, hares, mink and foxes. Eventually she grew tired of them and hunted more dangerous animals like wolves and bears. When unsuspecting travelers came through her woods, she discovered her new favorite prey, humans. Unlucky souls who strayed into her territory were slaughtered like any other animal. She liked to collect their tools and colorful garments, and especially toys when there were little ones. But she could never bring herself to kill the little girls. Girls she would take back to her house, deep in the woods. They were precious, and looking at them woke up something deep in her heart. She craved the closeness of a loved one, a child of her own. Among the pillaged wooden toys, dolls and storybooks she couldn't read, the girls would be tied by the neck with a rough and chafing rope fastened firmly to the wall. She couldn't let them wander off, or they would surely die outside. Every time, the girls would waste away and die of cold or starvation or sickness. Every time, it plunged Anna deeper into pain and sorrow and madness. She was compelled to try again, and started raiding the nearest villages to slaughter families and kidnap their daughters. She wore one of the animal masks her mother crafted for her so many years earlier to try to calm the frightened children. Villagers spread the legend of a half-beast lurking in Red Forest, the huntress, who killed men and ate little girls. War eventually came to the forest. German soldiers began to pass through, on the march to attack the collapsing Russian Empire. During these dark times, there were no more travelers. The villagers had abandoned their homes, and no more little ones to be found, only soldiers. Many of them were found with violent axe wounds. Whole groups disappeared mysteriously. Once the war was over, the rumors of the huntress disappeared with it, engulfed by the Red Forest. Whether killers perform their heinous acts by the compulsions of their diseased minds, or if they are forced into them by external pressures, has long been a matter of debate. But for one killer, nature and nurture are inextricably linked. Leatherface kills not from a desire to exert his will over others, to satisfy carnal urges, or even to quiet the voices in his head. He kills because he is scared. Scared that others will hurt him. Scared that his family will be displeased with him, scared that their shared willingness to eat human flesh will be discovered. He does as he is told. His family loves him, and that is all that matters. Outsiders are a threat, and threats need to be dealt with. Like those kids that came into the house, uninvited. Walked in like they owned the place. Looked around the house, trying to find out his family's secrets, no doubt. But Leatherface deals with them, and protects his family just as he's been taught. He is not just protector, he has many roles, and each role has its own face. He serves dinner, cares for the family, and dresses well when they eat. His grandpa and ma used to care for them all, but grandpa, he is old now and ma has been still for a while, so Leatherface and his brothers had to take over. Family is everything to him. Family is security and safety. But even though he did his best, one of the kids got away. He tried to stop her, chasing after her as fast as he could, but she had help, another outsider, driving a truck. The evil trucker killed his brother, ran him over like he was a possum. In a fury, Leatherface leapt at him, the so ready to avenge his family, but the trucker was too quick. He knocked Leatherface aside and turned his own saw against him. As he watched the outsiders driving away, the rage, grief and pain combined with the worry about what would happen to his family now. They would surely return with the police, and the police would take his brothers, his grandpa. Without them, what would he do? Without their commands, he would wither and die. As his world collapsed, Leatherface spun in circles, swinging the saw all around, trying to fight off the myriad external threats that surrounded him. Then another feeling overtook him. It came from outside his vision, crawling over his skin with cold dread. He realized that no matter what outsiders could do to him, there was something worse, something bigger that lived in the shadows. He was filled with a terror unlike any he had ever felt before. But it was almost comforting, like the fear he'd felt with his family. The fear of disappointing them. He was brought to a place that was familiar but unknowable, and he instinctively knew what he had to do. He couldn't fail it, the way he had his family. Outsiders would come, but he would use his skills to overcome any threats. There would be screaming, but he could make the world quiet again. Until the only sound remaining was the blessed howl of the saw. Let the outsiders come. Even while he lived, Freddy Krueger was a creature of nightmares for those who truly knew him. Hiding behind a mask of warmth and friendliness, Freddy's actual temperament was known only to his victims. When those victims were finally heard, the parents of Springwood tracked Freddy down and took the law into their own hands. They thought that fire had rid them of a monster that night, that their children were finally safe, but evil as strong as his has a way of surviving. Years passed, the horror was buried, the victims mercifully forgot. Then, somehow, Freddy returned, and dreams became nightmares once again. Freddy focused his anger on those he felt had wronged him, building up to his one true obsession, Nancy Holbrook. But he underestimated her strength and resourcefulness. Together with her friend Quentin Smith, she managed to weaken Freddy, mutilating him, and leaving him for dead once more. Death didn't want Freddy the first time he encountered it. Why did they think it would take him now? He emerged once more, consumed with vengeance. Then he turned his sights on the boy who had blocked his path to Nancy, his number one. Freddy invaded Quentin's dreams, terrorizing him night after night, until his strength and defenses would be at their lowest. When the time was right, he forced the boy to return to the dark reflection of Badham Preschool. Here he would have his final revenge. Freddy stalked the boy through the school's halls. He took his time, savoring every moment of the hunt. This was what he enjoyed the most, the smell of their sweat in the air, the ragged gasps of their terrified breath. They were his to toy with. There was the boy, at the end of a long corridor. Too tired and scared to run anymore. Resigned to his fate. Freddy closed in, arms wide, claws raking the wall. Their tips traced along a pipe, the metallic shrieking only adding to the boy's apprehension. A shower of sparks rained on the ground, and into the liquid that covered the tiled floor. A blue flame blossomed and quickly engulfed the room. The boy took flight as Freddy burst from the flames in a fury. Rooms and walls raced past in a blur until they were in Freddy's basement. There would be no escape from here. Slowly Freddy closed in on the boy. His fear was so strong now that Freddy could almost taste it, but his eyes burned with a defiant hatred that was almost admirable. Freddy drew back his claws. Then Freddy felt another presence with him, something old, powerful and dark. A miasma enveloped him, and the only sensation was a sound like wooden beams flexing and creaking in the distance. The echoing groan of metal crushed against metal. Something arcane and unknowable, halfway between language and pure terror. A moment of falling and spinning, and then Freddy was back in the school. But not his school. It looked the same, but it felt different. His powers were tempered in some ways and focused in others. The boy had gone for now, but another prey walked the hallways. Some would be inconsequential, others would become his new favorites. All would fall before his claws. When John Kramer, better known as Jigsaw, planned for his son to be born during the Chinese zodiac's Year of the Pig, he wanted it to represent fertility and rebirth, a new beginning for him and his wife, and the start of a charmed life for his son. But that plan was shattered on the night that a junkie broke into his wife's clinic, hoping to score. After this event resulted in the death of his unborn son, John finally caught up with the junkie, making him his first test subject, and the pig was changed forever too. It became a representation of the disease that was rotting John from the inside, a reminder that we are just meat unless we elevate ourselves by our actions, by grasping life from the jaws of death. The pig became a vessel, an agent of Jigsaw, conveying the subjects to their test. For some of those who emerged victorious, the pig could still be a rebirth into their new lives as apprentices, even disciples of Jigsaw. That was the case for Amanda Young, a troubled soul, whose life had been a catalogue of harm, both to herself and those around her. That changed when she faced and bested Jigsaw's test. Deciding her life was worth something, she became devoted to Jigsaw's cause, ready to take over when cancer consumed him. But she became more dependent on John, her anguish at his impending death combining with a belief that their test subjects weren't capable of saving themselves, of being reborn in the crucible of the games. Seeing this, John presented her with another game, another chance to save herself, but Amanda let her rage and jealousy rule her actions. She failed the test and took a bullet as a consequence. Bleeding out on the tiled floor, darkness engulfed Amanda's vision, accompanied by a sound like creaking wood. Then she was in a forest, once more viewing the world through the eyes of a pig. Trees surrounded her, their branches clawing at her from all sides. Waves of panic washed over her, and she could hear her breath reverberating inside the mask. Had she been damned, cursed to spend her days here in this guise? Or maybe this was another test. Maybe she hadn't failed at all. John always thought one step ahead of everyone else, planned for every eventuality, and he would never give up on her, surely. Jigsaw may have gone, but he had passed her on to another. A being for whom she would be the pig again. Ultimately, she saw now that she had been right in the choices she had made. The time for games was over. There was no chance of redemption for any of them. They were meat, and meat was destined for slaughter. Kenneth Chase was born in 1932 by a difficult labor, which his mother wouldn't survive. This event drove a rift between him and his father that never closed. As the boy grew, so did his father's resentment and his drinking habit. By the time Kenneth was at school, they lived mostly separate lives. Academically, he was unremarkable, coasting by on his significant athletic prowess. He grew tall and strong, excelling at track events, but shunned any attempts to coax him into team sports. On his walk home from school, he would often find feathers on the ground, and he soon began a collection, keeping them in a cigar box under his bed. With his father either at work or in an alcohol-induced stupor, Kenneth had hours to spend alone, transfixed by the regularity of the feathers' barbs and the feeling of softness as he ran them over his lips. Watching the birds that came to the feeder in his garden, he imagined how soft they must be and resolved to catch one. He ingratiated himself with the local dentist, soon procuring some anesthetic. Using this, he rigged up a trap on the feeder that he hoped would knock out a bird long enough that he could touch it. After a few failed attempts, he managed to trap a robin. As it lay in his hand, he felt a sudden rush of a life at his mercy. He had planned to release it once it recovered from the anesthetic. Instead, as its eyes flickered back into consciousness, and it began to struggle, his grip remained firm. His fingers slowly tightened around its throat, squeezing until its chest feathers were finally still. He disposed of the body, keeping just a feather, with which he started a new collection, discarding the others as fake. By the late 1940s, Kenneth had left school and started working as a busboy at a local diner. He had also escalated to larger prey, like squirrels, raccoons and dogs, becoming skilled at customizing the anesthetic dosage for each. In early 1954, a young man went missing, and the town was turned upside down in the search. A few months later, Kenneth's father, while doing some work in the crawlspace under the house, found a cigar box. He broke it open and saw, to his horror, that it contained feathers, animal paws, and a man's finger. Returning from work, Kenneth saw his father leaving the crawlspace with a cigar box in his hands. He turned on his heel, and never went home again. After a few weeks of living rough, he encountered a traveling circus and, with his prodigious strength, was hired to work the ropes. He assumed a new name, Jeffrey Hawk. Suddenly surrounded by a close-knit community, Jeffrey had to learn to socialize. He donned a new personality like a disguise, quickly becoming known as charming and helpful, and was welcomed into his new family. Over the next decade, he stayed with the circus, traveling the length and breadth of the United States. But with the itinerant life providing few repercussions, he fell into bad habits. Drinks, junk food, drugs, he indulged in all of them to excess. For a time, these vices were enough, but then his old urges returned and his nomadic existence became a cover for him to resume killing. He stole clothes and makeup from performers, fashioning a disguise that would let him get close to his victims before he anesthetized them, bringing them back to his caravan, where they would awake to find themselves bound and at his mercy. He would finally get to have his fun, mentally and physically torturing them, their screams fueling him, before being lost in the night. Once their strength was at its lowest, he would carefully examine their fingers, searching for the prettiest, running them over his tongue to find the tastiest. Once he found the best, he would cut it from their hand and proudly add it to his collection, disposing of the rest of the body as pointless waste. Men, women, young, old, he didn't care. The essence of a good collection is in the variety, in the memories and stories they evoke. He removed the costume less and less, shedding his old personality with it, fully embracing the clown, his true self. With time, he became complacent and sloppy. A victim managed to work free of her bindings while he was sleeping off the drink. She escaped, screaming for help, and he awoke to find the rest of the circus bearing down on him. He whipped his horse and the caravan disappeared into the night. Since then he has roamed the country, a parasite who could always be found at a carnival or circus, but who would never be seen on any playbill. He lured those brave or foolish enough to come near, trapped them and moved on before they could be found missing. Somewhere along the way, he left the ordinary roads of the United States behind him, traveling through a veil of mist and entering a new realm. It was a place of transience and impermanence, perfectly suiting the life he had chosen to lead. Feeling more at home than he had in his entire life, he set up camp and waited for his first visitor. Rin was the only child of the Yamaoka family. She was raised in the dusty halls of a traditional house in Kagawa. She studied education at Takamatsu, a private university, which weighed heavily on her family's shaky finances. Her mother got ill that year, and the bills started piling up. Rin worked part-time in a futile attempt to help lighten the load. Her father faced a debt that grew without end. He started working double shifts in hopes of obtaining a promotion. That's when he started losing sleep. A dark whisper would keep him awake all night, reminding him of his hopeless situation. Exhausted, he started to lose grasp of reality. Fighting to deny what the voice whispered at night, Rin's father made a desperate move. He met with his superior and explained his situation. He begged for a bonus, an advance, time off, anything. His request was denied. The company had launched a defective production line that was costing them dearly. Someone had to be held accountable, and Rin's father fitted the bill perfectly. He was fired after 22 years of service. That evening, Rin came home from work. She'd stayed late to entertain customers that lingered at the restaurant. As she parked her bike in the shed, she heard her mother's scream come from the house. She rushed in, climbing up the stairs to her parents' room. There she found bits and pieces of her mother on the floor. Her limbs were clean-cut, tangled up in an unnatural position. Her breasts were sliced up, revealing her rib cage, which was cracked open. Rin gagged. A sharp katana came crashing down. Rin blocked the blade, which bit into her bare forearm. The shock of recognition interrupted her pain. Her father was wielding the katana with a stoic expression. She cried out to make him stop, but he slashed her arm again. She rushed off and slid on the blood-smeared floor. Using the door frame as support, she raised herself up. The katana ripped through the wall, cleaving her other arm. She screamed in pain as she limped into the hallway, only to be met by her father's blade. She stepped back, trembling, as she held together the soft loose flesh of her abdomen. Images of her mother's tangled limbs flashed before her eyes. Rin charged at her father, making him stumble back. He punched her torn abdomen, and she recoiled in pain. As she struggled to get back up, he slashed her thigh, making her collapse on the floor. As she crawled towards the stairs, he grabbed her hair and yanked her against a partition. The glass shattered on impact and she fell through, landing one floor down. She heard footsteps somewhere above her. With effort, she moved, worming her way into a sea of broken glass. The shards gnawed at her, ripping her flesh. He had to be stopped. He would not get away with what he'd done to her. With what he'd done to her mother. Coughing up blood, her chin grazed the glass, adding to the bleeding. A low-pitched heartbeat started to ring in her ears. Her body felt so heavy she could no longer move. The ground shook with her father's footsteps. She knew she was not going to make it, but she no longer cared. She would make him pay, in this life or the next. A dark fog slowly veiled her eyes, but it could not subdue her rage. She would not rest, not yet. The darkness whispered, promising blood and revenge. An oath was made and Rin closed her eyes. Frank Morrison was 19, and had little to show for it. He'd stopped attending school after being kicked out of the basketball team for shoving a referee into the stands. Yet Frank was a man of potential, who could light up a room despite his bleak childhood. At 6 years old, he'd been taken away from Calgary to start a circuit of foster homes. No matter how many times he'd lashed out, threw tantrums and got into fights, they'd kept moving him to new, unfamiliar houses. His last move had been 3 years prior when his last foster dad, Clive Andrews, had picked him up from the adoption center. They'd been on the road for 7 hours before reaching a small bungalow in Ormond. It would be the longest time they'd spend together. Clive was too busy trading checks from family services for drinks at the bar. Ormond was a small, stale place, a remote town of 6,000 inhabitants where grey winters drag on for most of the year. Frank did everything he could to get into another adoptive family, but he changed his mind when he caught the attention of Julie, a beautiful girl who was convinced that she deserved better than a life in Ormond, and Frank, as an outsider, was her ticket out. Frank attended the parties she threw where everyone was younger than him and easily impressed, which he liked. He met the impulsive Joey, who liked to show off, and the shy, naive Susie, who was Julie's best friend. They would hang out at an abandoned lodge up Mount Ormond. Their time together was the perfect break from the boring conformity of their small, insignificant everyday lives. Frank saw it as an opportunity to shape their lack of experience into something powerful. He lined up nights of debauchery and rampage, testing their limits. Bullying, vandalism, and theft were essentially their weekend plans. It came to a point where they would do anything he asked. Nothing was off limits when they put their masks on. One evening, Frank dared Joey to vandalize the store that had recently fired him. They snuck inside easily enough, as the building was supposed to be empty after closing hours. But a cleaner who was still there grabbed Julie as soon as she came near. Hearing her stifled cries, a dark impulse took over Frank. He rushed to her aid, knife in hand, and without hesitating, planted the blade into the cleaner's back. As the group stared at Frank in shock, he ordered them to finish the job. Joey clenched his jaw, grabbed the knife, and stabbed the bleeding man in the ribs. Susie didn't want to do it. Frank shouted at her, they had to finish what they'd started. Julie closed her eyes and slid the knife into the man's chest. She handed the wet blade to Susie. They were all in this together now. Susie stared at Julie in disbelief as Frank grabbed her trembling hands and inserted the knife deep into the man's throat. Frank told them to move fast. They mopped the blood off the floor, stashed the body in the trunk of Joey's car, and drove up Mount Ormond. All four were digging in the muddy snow to dispose of the body when Frank spotted something moving through the woods. He grabbed his knife and broke from the group to check it out. The fog thickened around Frank, becoming so dense that he soon could no longer see ahead. He retraced his steps and stumbled onto an ominous trail. He followed the eerie path, as if called by the darkness. Julie, Susie, and Joey finished digging, but Frank was nowhere to be seen. Julie spotted his muddy footsteps in the snow, and the three of them followed the trail, which took them deeper into the woods. When Julie, Susie, and Joey did not return home that night, their parents thought they'd run away with Frank. Each family came up with a different theory. The mood in the town changed, however, when a body was found by an abandoned lodge up Mount Ormond. When she was 5 years old, Adiris, the youngest of a family of 7, was left on the brick-red burning steps of the Temple of Purgation at the center of Babylon. To process her shock and sorrow, she held on to the belief that the gods had a plan for her. Her new life was one of quiet servitude. She would tend to the gardens, prepare ceremonial meals, and polish ceremonial incense burners. At night, she would pray for a sign that would reveal her purpose. When she came of age, she attended the high-ranking priests during the yearly worshipping of the sea-goat, the god of water and creation. Swinging a censer down the great hypostyle hall, she cast thick black fumes that reached the cold towering stone pillars before dissipating. Her worries lifted, and the resulting bliss made her feel closer to the gods than ever. She worked herself to the bone each day that followed, fulfilling her duties while taking on new ones, as she aided the priests during purification rituals. The priests were more and more in need of assistance. Cleansings were being performed daily to answer the demand from outside the high temple walls, where a catastrophic plague had resurfaced. Within months, the priests contracted the disease. It did not take long before they became too weak to perform any kind of ritual. Adiris, having assisted many purification rituals, was the only one able to carry on. The swelling panic had to be contained, even if by a novice. Anxious before her first ceremony, Adiris visited the priest's sanctuary chamber. When she lit the candles, she noticed a narrow opening at the back. Sliding through the gap, she reached a crypt hidden under the sanctuary. The chamber was bare except for the golden statue of a woman, who stood with outstretched hands, her fingers covered in jewels. It was the sign Adiris had been waiting for. The great hall was packed with followers who bowed down as Adiris entered. She strode to the brick altar and grabbed a ceremonial dagger forged in silver, her ruby-ringed fingers wrapping around the blade like claws. The sudden display of luxury intrigued the followers, who were struck already by her youth and beauty. As she began reciting the epic of creation, a woman at the back swooned and collapsed. Adiris rushed to her and noticed the black blisters covering her feet. Without hesitation, Adiris grabbed her sacred blade and swung it at her own foot, severing a toe. Then she offered the bloody part to the gods, asking them to protect the woman. A silence fell over the followers, who revered Adiris as their new priestess. Tales of her wealth, beauty, and devotion began to spread across the city as quickly as the disease. Soon, Adiris' followers called her the High Priestess of Babylon. But her faith was tried when she showed the first signs of infection. Her cough became a mix of phlegm and blood, her neck erupted in abscesses, and her four-toed foot darkened. Ashamed of her condition, she began wearing a veiled headpiece and carried a censer that masked the rancid smell of sick that clung to her skin. Hoping to be saved, she kept performing the rituals, offering blessed water and food to her followers. But no ritual could save her. In a desperate attempt to appease the gods, Adiris banished herself from the city. She traveled north with a few followers, venturing through the cold woodlands of Urashtu, until it was no longer possible to walk. They camped in a damp cave, where Adiris lay in a pool of vomit. Her foot, which had turned black, was so swollen she could not go any further. Her followers and she realized the truth in that cave. They were all infected with the plague. Kneeling among her retching followers, Adiris made one last prayer. The black fumes of incense rose into the damp air before being wiped off by a cold breeze. Neither the body of Adiris nor those of her followers were ever found. Many told tales of her return, but no one truly knew what fate had befallen the High Priestess of Babylon. Danny Johnson, known as Jed Olson by some, grabbed the newspaper from the kitchen counter. It was a week old, but his face was on the front page, grainy and sunken. It was one of those muggy afternoons in Florida when heat and humidity permeated everything in the kitchen, making him sweat while standing still. He slouched in a damp chair to read. This article had better be good. His work in Roseville had been outstanding. Ghostface disappears June 18, 1993. At first glance, Jed Olson was a modest and enthusiastic freelancer with experience in a variety of small newspapers. The staff at the Roseville Gazette appreciated how easygoing and honest he seemed, and so he was treated as a stranger for no more than 5 minutes into his interview. Jed quickly spotted the editor-in-chief in the room, gave him a wide smile and a firm handshake, and talked about good old American values. And that was it, he was in. Ex-contributor at the Roseville Gazette. Olson never justified his erratic career path, which zigzagged between several small towns from Utah to Pennsylvania. There was no verification of his previous jobs. He had a decent portfolio plus a good attitude, and they needed a contributor right away. The Roseville murders. Olson had been working at the newspaper for 5 months when the Roseville murders began, victims from young to old, stabbed to death in their homes. From the reports, the victims seemed chosen at random, yet the killer knew his way around in the houses. The multiple stab wounds indicated a personal motive. No traces of DNA were found. The local police were confounded. The murders were carried with fury akin to a crime of passion yet coldly premeditated. The murderer also liked to stalk his targets. 2 victims had reported being followed on their way home by a dark figure, a few days prior their death. The killer would follow them from Walleye's, a small bar in northern Roseville, and snap pictures of them at home, while looking for a way in. He could watch the same victim for weeks, meticulously registering their habits and routines. When he felt the urge to kill, he'd visit the most vulnerable victim on his list, and break inside the house quietly. The whole staff worked on the Roseville murders story. Olson was often sent to interview the family of victims and relay official statements from the police. Unknown to everyone at the time, his involvement added to the final body count. GF Lore 2. The Ghost Face. Panic swelled in Roseville when Olson produced footage of a hooded figure breaking into a house at night. The masked face, a white blur in the dark, stared at the camera for a second before disappearing inside. The ghost face caught on tape was the resulting article, written by Olson. He seemed proud of his work at the time, enjoying how the whole town feared his ghost stories. Weeks later, Olson left a note on his work desk and disappeared. "I hope you liked my stories. I enjoyed bringing them to life. Don't worry, I'm not done." Jed Olson. The Roseville law enforcement still refuses to comment as Jed Olson remains at large. Danny smiled, ripping out the article from the newspaper. When the investigation had been pointing to him, he'd packed his bags and left Roseville swiftly. He got up, the clammy seat pulling his skin. An oppressive humidity engulfed him as he entered the bedroom. Condensation dribbled on a small misted-up window as bits of cracked wallpaper hung limply. Its floral pattern was covered with gruesome photos and newspaper headlines. Danny pinned the week-old article on top of a picture of lacerated scalps. A faint pang of hunger hit him, and he wondered when he had eaten last. Was it this morning, while washing his knife and clothes? Or was it last night, after following that girl down the street? He couldn't remember clearly. Taking a step back, he admired his work on the wall. His mind drifted, remembering all the articles he'd written, the stories he'd planned, and the scenes he'd brought to life. A shiver ran through him. A chilling breeze transformed the bedroom's humidity into an opaque, freezing fog. A woman shrieked. Dead leaves crunched under his feet. He smiled in anticipation. A blooming mouth full of needle-like teeth for a face, large, curved, razor-sharp claws, and powerful legs to pounce on victims, make the Demogorgon a frightening monster to face in any dimension. It is a nightmare of unrestrained, feral rage as it hunts down its prey and rips it to pieces, devouring every last morsel of flesh and gore, leaving nothing for scavengers. The creature is untouched by any sense of compassion or restraint. Looming over its victim, it shows no doubt or mercy, just the pure instinct of its insatiable bloodlust as it delivers the death blow. A perfect hunter, the Demogorgon is a macabre testament to the horrors lurking in the Upside Down, and why it was choice pickings for the entity. Honoring his family name was never enough for Kazan Yamaoka. He wanted to surpass his father's reputation, and end what he saw as the thinning of samurai culture, with farmers often posing as samurai. His father tried to turn Kazan's attention to more noble pursuits, but Kazan refused to heed his advice, and borrowing his father's katana, he embarked on a dark pilgrimage to prove his worth and rid Japan of impostors. Ignoring the code that had been taught to him, Kazan killed impostors in the hills and the valleys, on the beaches and in the woodland. The killings were brutal, cruel and morbid. He humiliated farmers and warriors alike, yanking off their topknots and stripping them of their armor. His rage, bloodlust and perverse sense of honor knew no bounds. Monks believed he was possessed by something dark and otherworldly and cursed him, while a noble lord began to call him Oni Yamaoka, the rageful samurai, an insult both to Kazan and his family. Determined to redeem his family's name, Kazan now butchered anyone who dared call him Oni Yamaoka. The insult confused him. He had defeated the best, and he had purified the samurai class by ridding the land of impostors. How could anyone refer to him as an ogre? Had it been because he had marched onto a battlefield to cut down the fiercest warriors? Had it been because he had taken a kanabo and dashed hundreds of skulls with it? Or had it been because of his need to secure a trophy from his victims? It didn't matter. Being called an ogre was more than he could bear, and an ominous voice in his head urged him to strike down the lord who had desecrated his name. As Kazan made for the lord's town, he suddenly found himself face to face with a samurai standing on a dirt road, blocking his way. Kazan readied his kanabo. Without a word, the samurai attacked and quickly secured the upper hand. But he hesitated. With a devastating blow, Kazan crushed the samurai's head and cracked his helmet. As Kazan approached the fallen samurai, he saw his father's face and staggered back to his haunches. His father stared at Kazan with mingled shame and regret as he issued his last breath. Kazan closed his eyes and screamed in agony until he could scream no more. When he opened his eyes again, his father was gone. Not only had he killed his father, but he had allowed thieves to steal his body for armor. Bitter, lost and disillusioned, Kazan roamed the land aimlessly, with his father's voice rattling in his head, taunting him, reminding him of his failures, sending him into fits of uncontrollable black rage. One day, walking in the woods, Kazan happened upon an Oni statue. He stopped and stood motionless for a long moment. The weathered and overgrown statue seemed to be ridiculing him, accusing him of being the imposter samurai he had so desperately sought to destroy. Kazan shook the laughing voice out of his head, and half remembered the lord who had ridiculed him as Oni Yamaoka. With renewed anger, Kazan journeyed to a town high up in the snowy mountains where the lord resided. A dozen samurai met Kazan at the gates of the town. A dozen samurai fell to his kanabo. His speed and strength were unmatched. His rage was incomprehensible. Covered in blood and gore, Kazan battled through the town and soon found the lord hiding in a villa. He dragged him out of a cabinet, sliced his tendons to immobilize him, and watched him beg and squirm like a dog. Without hesitation, he thrust his fist into the lord's mouth and yanked out the wicked tongue that had desecrated his name. Satisfied, Kazan exited the villa to find himself surrounded by dozens of farmers wielding rusted scythes, sharp pitchforks, and heavy clubs. He survived the first few assaults, but there were too many attackers coming from every direction. Within moments, Kazan was on the ground staring at a cold, indifferent, darkening sky as farmers took turns stabbing and torturing the Oni, who had butchered their beloved lord. The frenzied mob dragged Kazan into a small stone mill to continue the torture and finally left him to die a slow, agonizing death. When they returned, the mill was filled with a strange black fog, and Kazan's body and the kanabo were nowhere to be found. It was the beginning of a dark legend about a rageful Oni haunting the town. Born in the dust-ridden badlands of the American Midwest, Caleb Quinn was son to struggling Irish immigrants. On the edge of the frontier, sickness, famine, and death were common sights, and pioneers contended for whatever scraps they could claim while tycoons feasted. Caleb's father, once an engineer, had few options to ply his trade as businesses posted a common sign, "No Irish need apply." His antiquated tools laid untouched for years until Caleb uncovered them. Noticing his son's interest in the trade, he gifted him his old wrench. The devices Caleb made under his father's guidance had quaint applications, but when his father was away, they took a grim turn. He hid plans for a mask that would gouge barbed needles into a human's eyes and rip them from their sockets, complete with sketches of it fitted on boys who bullied him. With age, Caleb's engineering abilities became marketable, and employers put their discrimination aside. Henry Bayshore, the owner of United West Rail, hired him. Caleb first invented a gun that shot railroad spikes into the ground. Next, he made a steam-powered tunneling drill. But as Bayshore feigned indifference, the devices began turning up at other companies, the patents stolen from Caleb and sold. A familiar sensation coursed through Caleb's blood, feeding the sharp pain in his heart. Rage overwhelming him, he burst into Bayshore's office and smashed his face into a bloody stew. As he was pulled away, he pushed his specialized gun to his boss gut and squeezed the trigger. A railroad spike plowed through skin and viscera, nailing Bayshore to his desk. The only thing that saved Caleb from hanging was Bayshore's unlikely survival. For 15 years, Caleb was confined to Hell's Higher Penitentiary, the nation's first private prison. In a fortress of illiterate convicts, he found an unlikely friend in the educated prison warden. He designed torture devices for him, and in return received extra meals. After a time, the warden offered to commute his sentence. He spoke of something greater than monetary wealth, political capital, and that his connections could have Bayshore framed and rotting behind bars for life. He had only one request: make him rich. Fill the prison. Use ingenuity to bring outlaws in alive. Caleb returned to his workshop, and with a few modifications emerged with something new, the spear gun. The first trial occurred when a thief robbed a Chinese laundry. Seizing on the opportunity, Caleb unleashed his prototype. Metal joints screeched as the spike shot forward, gouging into the target's abdomen. But as the spear tugged, it caught the thief's intestines, and with an ungodly sound, yanked them onto the dusty road. After several iterations, the disembowelments dwindled, but Caleb had already earned his new nickname, the Deathslinger. Looking to protect his asset, the prison warden pulled strings and released Irish inmates to form Caleb's posse. The Hell's Higher Gang was born. For 6 years, they roamed the country collecting wanted outlaws for the prison, fulfilling their end of the bargain. After a bloody battle at Glenvale, Caleb caught notice of a newspaper headline. Henry Bayshore purchases Hell's Higher Penitentiary. In the picture, a disfigured Bayshore proudly shook the warden's hand. Caleb's heart pounded with rage, blood swelling as if it would burst from his veins. He'd been sold out, a pawn in a rich man's game. The Hell's Higher Gang pledged their loyalty to Caleb and called for the warden's head. In a thundering gallop, they smashed through the prison entrance, shrieking like bloodthirsty marauders. A guard raised his pistol but hesitated. A spear punctured his chest. Caleb grabbed the man's head and slammed it against a prison cell until it spilled through the bars. Reaching the warden's office, Caleb kicked the door and was met with a fortunate sight. It wasn't only the prison warden who cowered in a corner, but Henry Bayshore. Overpowered with rage, Caleb rushed to Bayshore, beating, bludgeoning, tearing at his flesh. The man's blood dripped from his face, crimson pooling at his feet. The Hell's Higher Gang swarmed the warden, snapping bones with each kick. With the two men broken and begging for death, the posse dragged them to the commons, where they were left to the growing crowd of prisoners. Soaked in blood and sweat, Caleb hobbled to his old cell, hardly paying notice to Bayshore's screams. He sat on the bed's edge as drops of blood ran from his fingertips. A thick, unnatural fog streamed through the barred window. He pulled out his old wrench, cracked and rusted, and ran a thumb along the metal, regarding it with faded eyes. He couldn't remember when it came into his possession. He didn't care to remember. At his feet, he saw a dusty path, and at its end, silhouettes of all who had done him wrong, the boys who bullied him, the executives who took advantage of him, and again. Henry Bayshore. Emerging from a fog were the tools to dispose of them. Unforgiving steel hooks, brilliant and beautiful in their simplicity. Pain tore through his leg as he stood, but he endured, pushing onwards, walking the dusty path, leaving a trail of blood flowing behind him. A sadistic and merciless executioner, Pyramid Head is fixated on dispensing punishment through pain. Encumbered by the steel frame upon his head, and with a hulking great blade in tow, he stalked the hellish corridors of Silent Hill, committed to a duty that no one truly understood. Where he trod, even monsters fled for the shadows, and those who crossed his path fell victim to unrestrained acts of aggression. When his duty was complete and his presence no longer needed, he prepared for the long rest, and yet, his skills were required elsewhere. The fog that streamed over him was somehow different than that he was accustomed to in Silent Hill, as if each wisp contained the nerves of a creature, writhing, seeking him out. There was an unspoken agreement in that moment. The billowing cloud was an invitation to duty and sadism, and Pyramid Head, taking a step into the fog, accepted his obligation once more. To understand the human condition, one must rise above it. This was the credo of Talbot Grimes, a Scottish chemist whose unrestrained ambition took him to towering heights. As a boy, he was a popular child, bright, charismatic, and unafraid to challenge authority, yet despite his social graces he was fiercely independent, spending much of his time exploring the sprawling fields near his town alone. What began as a child's curiosity nearly turned deadly after experimenting with a patch of poisonous foxglove. For days, he laid in bed dripping with sweat, purging any food that touched his stomach. When he recovered, it wasn't fear that gripped him, but fascination. There was something magical in how a single flower could so drastically affect him. Into his adult years, his ambition developed as quickly as his questionable methods. He attended the London School of Medicine and excelled despite several reprimands. His willingness to push the limits secured him a position with the British East India Company, and within 7 years he was made head chemist. In time, he completed one of his greatest achievements, a chemical that could increase a worker's productivity while reducing their need for rest. He was rewarded with a secret laboratory beneath a prison camp on Dyer Island. There, off the coast of India, prisoners from the Opium War became his unwilling subjects, leading to a drug that allowed soldiers to withstand incredible amounts of pain. Though most side effects were minor, there were rumors that a small number of soldiers went mad. In feral states, they massacred villages, impaling the populace on bayonets, leaving them hanging from trees. There were no official reports on the subject, and Talbot refused to blame himself for what could only be exaggerated war stories. Though his callous brilliance seemed unflappable, he was ignorant to the enemies his questionable work had amassed. The realization struck him quite literally, with a steel pipe to the back of his head during a trip to Mangalore. He was bound and loaded into a wagon. When his blindfold was removed, a sickly man showed him a mass grave filled with hundreds of bodies. Unbeknownst to Talbot, his productivity-increasing drug had killed nearly an entire factory's worth of workers. He knew he couldn't defend himself against the anger and accusations of his abductor. All he could do was curl up as the blows from the steel pipe rained down. His body was thrown into the grave and left for dead. Shifting between consciousness and the darkest black, he crawled for an escape, fingers sinking into rotting flesh. Black flies feasted on his uncovered skin, the sensation of 100 pinpricks stabbing into him. As he collapsed, he came face to face with a dead woman's dazzling hazel eyes. Too weak to pull away, he could do nothing but witness his life's work. Then, from the edge of death, he was brought back. He found himself on a small bed as a kindly, wrinkled face looked over him. With each pained breath, he was nursed back to health in an ancient mystery school posing as a monastery. In verdant gardens behind tall, unassuming walls, monks studied forbidden texts, striving to expand the human mind in the search for other dimensions, believing one to be connected to the other. Talbot's knowledge proved indispensable, his mind-altering chemicals integrating seamlessly with theories of neural expansion. He realized then that his salvation was no coincidence, He was plucked from the pit specifically to advance the school's knowledge. He agreed to help until his recovery was complete, being tasked with researching what the monks called the soul chemical, a compound derived from the pineal gland that could open the mind's eye. What began as a favor to his saviors soon became an obsession. Poring over the school's archives of lost texts, he uncovered scientific formulas that confirmed previously unthinkable ideas. He dreamt of ushering humankind into a new period of enlightenment. Perhaps then, the nightmares of hundreds of dead factory workers, and of those two hazel eyes, would fade from his mind. As he came closer to a breakthrough, the demeanor of the monks shifted. The gentle smiles they offered were paired with uneasy eyes that quickly darted away when spotted. The polite conversations he was once privy to turned to hushed murmurs. The last thing he would see of the school was the cracked ceiling above his bed, branching like a dendrite through plaster. His next memories were a shattered mosaic of images and sensations. Smearing lights, horse hoofs on cobblestone, coarse burlap scratching at his cheeks, and sharp bites into his arm. He awoke ragged and unwashed, splayed on the straw mattress of an opium den. Mind in a dense fog, his first thought was of his notes, the only record of his groundbreaking revelations. He searched frantically, scrambling through the dingy basement, pleading aloud for help. The few other denizens looked up from their hammocks, offering nothing but drug-soaked eyes and apathetic gazes that soon fell into half-slumber. Before he noticed the robed figure appear behind him, a needle plunged into his arm, and the world disappeared once more. Awoken. Again. Each time, hazier than the last. He tongued at hollow gaps between his teeth. How long, he wondered. A faint memory returned. The soul chemical. His notes. The verge of a breakthrough. A faraway whisper entered his mind. He fumbled with a stone, sharpening it with shaking hands. In the dim light of the den, amongst the catatonic occupants, he carved his research from memory into the walls. He wrote for hours until his fingers bled, moving to the floor, taking in everything the voice whispered despite his inability to comprehend it. When there was nowhere left to write, he gripped the stone and carved the message into his chest. Stained with blood, he witnessed a miracle appear before him, a magnificent field of lush, orange flowers. The whispered voice beckoned to him, urging him to enter the field and discover worlds and dimensions beyond human comprehension. For a moment, Talbot felt the sense of wonder he possessed as a child. The denizens of the opium den awoke to silence, the dry scent of smoke still lingering in the air. Shambling out of their drug-hazed fog, they found the stone floor wet with blood, tiny rivulets coursing through the cracks. As eyes adjusted to the darkened room, the jagged lettering scrawled along its length began to appear. Written over and over without end, there was but one single line: "Death is only the beginning." If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe this video if you want more Dead by Daylight content.